this is a talk that I gave at a place called the Beckman Institute. This is sort of a National Academy of Sciences institute, and it's very general. And I gave it to undergrads, and so I thought this would be perfect for you guys as well. And so the idea is going to be that I want to just share with you my research, but I really want to share with you some ideas of how we can take imaging and we can apply imaging to study materials and study very specific and sort of hard to study aspects of materials. So these might be things that you're not really familiar with. And so I really encourage you to ask me questions if things are unclear, okay? I really would like this to be kind of informal and more of a discussion. But the idea is I'm very interested in what are called materials dynamics. How do you change one material to another? How do you go from one structure to another? How does that evolve at the atomic level, right? How do the atoms actually move when it goes through these processes? And can we actually watch that happen, right? That to me is sort of the coolest thing about that is, can I actually watch these materials change in real time? And so I think to start, we have to understand, A, how do we normally look at materials at the levels that we want, meaning atoms? And then what can we do in terms of time resolution currently? And then what do we actually need to do much better, right? So if you think about it, atoms move fast, right? They're moving really, really quick. So how do we actually develop tools to watch that process? That's going to be the idea. So I don't know how much you know about electron microscopes. I'm going to basically give you one slide on electron microscopy, and I'll show you one example of what we can do with sort of state-of-the-art, what are state-of-the-art transmission electron microscopes. And then I'll segue that to what we do, which is ultrafast electron microscopy. Sounds very fancy, and I think it's very fancy. Hopefully you will think it's very fancy too when we're done. And I want to tell you why we might want to do that, why we might want to take this approach and how we do that. And then I'll end with one example, just one specific example of the research that we do that will hopefully impress to you why having this particular capability is now opening up areas of understanding that we just couldn't get to before. Okay? So that's what we're gonna do. So I want to start by sort of giving you a little bit of information, right? So everyone here has heard of X-ray diffraction, right? You all heard of that in 3011. Maybe you heard of that in other courses as well. You have a general idea about how X-ray diffraction works, right? And so you know that you have to use X-ray photons because of the diffraction limit. I want to see spacings between atoms and so on, so it's very small, so I can't use visible photons, so on and so forth. You're all pretty familiar with that. But did you know that you can actually do the same thing with fast electrons, right? So the reason you can do that is because this guy, Louis de Broglie, a long time ago basically came up with this expression where he said, look, anything that I can accelerate to some very high velocity, an electron was what he looked at, but it could be a proton, it could be anything that I can accelerate to a very high velocity is going to have a very short wavelength, right? Because the velocity is in the denominator here, right? So that's very important. And this was really a profound thing that he wrote. There's no way to derive this from first principles. He just sort of came up with this, right? It's wave-particle duality, or wave-particle duality of matter, right? You all have heard of that in general physics at some point. So this was the guy that came up with it, and he did it for his PhD thesis, got a Nobel Prize for it a couple years later. So, you know, pretty big deal at the time. So this is really important for us because what it says now is, and a lot of smart people at the time said, hey, wait a minute, that means I could potentially use electrons to image atoms. And what they even did some really crazy calculations, and they said, well, we might be able to image like the nuclei, we might be able to image a proton, right? Like, of course, that's crazy, but that's what they were really excited about. This was done in 1924, and it was only a couple years later where they experimentally verified it, and they wrote this in a paper where they were just sending in fast electrons into a crystal of nickel, right? And they got this weird scattering pattern that they couldn't identify. And they wrote in the paper that they were like, okay, I think this is actually what Louis de Broglie was talking about. We might have it here. And so that was only a few years later. And so it went really fast from there. So this guy named Bush, he figured out that I can take an electromagnetic lens, which he built for the first time in 1926, and that he can set up a magnetic field. You guys know Lorentz force, right? You've heard of that, really the Hall effect and so on. But the Lorentz force, I can use that to push electrons around, just like you would in the Hall effect, right? So that's what he figured out. Oh, I can send electrons through the center of one of these electromagnetic lenses, and I can move and change their trajectories super easy, right? So that's very important. And then Hans Bethe did some calculations and said, wow, electrons, when they interact with materials, should actually interact much, much more strongly than an X-ray photon will. So why is that important? That's important because I don't need very many to actually get information out of the material. X-ray photons, I actually have to flood the material with X-ray photons because they don't really interact too strongly with the material. So this is all adding up to be very exciting, right? And so what you can do is you can start to think about a fast electron. That has a kinetic energy with it, right? You can associate some kinetic energy to that, right? So the charge of the electron times some potential drop that you would send that through, okay? I can rearrange that so that I can have an expression for the velocity of that electron, which is dependent upon the mass, dependent upon the potential drop that I send it through, right? So this is the rest mass. I would have to correct for some relativistic effects here, but I'm going to ignore that for right now. And so what I can do is then combine all this together, and I can say, oh, wait, now I have an expression for the wavelength of this fast electron. And if you look, I've got V, uppercase V here, the potential drop I'm going to send it through. So what does that tell you? That tells you if I can build something where I can dial in V, right? I can set the potential drop, the voltage that I want to send it through. I can control the wavelength of that particle. So I can control the dimensions that I can resolve just by tuning the voltage. Huge, right? This is a huge, huge breakthrough. And it wasn't very long after that that a couple of guys, Noel and Ruska, developed the first transmission electron microscope based on all of these ideas, where they said, look, if we can do this, we could image atoms, right, with these fast electrons. We have, the physics says we can do it, right? Now we have some experiments that are coming together, some engineering, we're building lenses, we're building different things, and we might be able to do it. So a side note, it turns out that this first microscope, this is what this is, the voltage source is here, and so there's a specimen position here, and so on and so forth. It was pretty bad, and in fact, optical microscopes were better. So it was awful. This thing was just really, really bad. A few years later, they started doing much better. So there was a big, big disconnect, right? They were so hoping they could see like the nucleus of an atom and so on and so forth. I mean, you probably couldn't even see your finger if you tried to take a look at it. It was so awful. And it turns out that's because humans build these things, right? We build these things and we make mistakes. And we're not very good at machining things. And back then, we really weren't very good, as was evident by the resolution they got, right? So we had to do a lot of improvement between 1932 and now, right, to get to where we are. So where are we now? Let's take a look at that. So first, I just want to show you what a transmission electron microscope looks like if you don't know, TEM for short. So it's kind of a tall column. It's a column of lead, basically, that has a bunch of lenses inside of it, electromagnetic lenses inside of it, and different apertures, different regions to hold your specimen. And so at the top, you're going to have where you generate your electrons. Normally, how you do this is you're going to heat a crystal that has a low work function. And if it has a low work function and you heat it enough, you can get electrons to come tunnel out, and then you can accelerate them through your potential drop, in this case about 200 kilovolts. Okay, so pretty high voltages. If you went back and used de Broglie's expression to calculate what the wavelength of that electron is going to be, it's about 2.5 picometer. Okay, and so I'm going to calibrate you to a picometer in a second, okay, but just keep that number in mind. It's going to accelerate down through some lenses, through some apertures, and so on, and then the specimen is going to be located here. That's where you're going to scatter these electrons off of the material you're interested in studying, okay? So you're going to scatter them off of that specimen, and then there's some more lenses that they're going to go through here where you can either do diffraction or you can do imaging, okay? And you're going to switch between different settings based upon what you want to do. And then all of those electrons are going to come down and they're going to interact with some camera down here, and you're going to analyze your data then, okay? So that's how this works. So why use these fast electrons? So let's think about these numbers again. So the diffraction limit, generally this is about 2 times whatever the feature length is that you want to resolve, okay? So if you're talking about spacings between gold atoms in a crystal of gold, this is going to be about 3 angstrom or so. So you can do the math, right? And so then again, I have this wavelength of about 0.025 angstrom, 25 picometer. So what it says is, if I want to resolve this spacing with these electrons, oh, I'm more than good, right? I'm set. I have no problem with doing this. That's what this is telling me. In practice, remember again, we build these things, we make mistakes, we can't get them perfect. And so really what we can get with one of these TEMs is about 0.6 angstrom resolution. Still way better than what I really need. Okay, so I'm good to go. I'm definitely in good shape. And so just to kind of calibrate you a little bit further, do you guys know what the Bohr radius is? Okay, for those of you that don't, it's the average distance between the electron and the proton in a hydrogen atom. Okay, so think about that, and then look at that scale, and then look at where we are. This is what we can experimentally do, okay? So we're not bad. We're doing pretty good with these things. So an example is just this. This is what a column of atoms will look like, okay, when we take a picture of these in one of these microscopes. So this is a material, lanthanum iron arsenic oxide. It's not very interesting, but as soon as you start exchanging out some of the oxygen with fluorine, just a little bit, it becomes a superconductor at pretty high temperatures, like 30, 40 Kelvin, something like that, okay? Which is high temperature for superconductors, right? Yeah, that's for superconductors, that's a high temperature. Other things, not so much. But this is the cartoon of what this would look like. So this picture is looking down this direction. Okay, and so we have it color-coded and overlaid here, so you know which columns of atoms are where, right? And so what this says is that with one of these instruments, yep, we are actually pretty good at getting images of the arrangements of atoms in these materials. Okay, so that's pretty remarkable, right? In less than 100 years, no problem, we can do this. Pretty nice, okay? So that's kind of where we are now. The spatial resolution of these TEMs, definitely more than sufficient for imaging atoms. We've got this figured out. This has been actually figured out for probably 20 years. It's not a problem anymore for us. We have microscopes on campus that can do this, no problem, okay? Well, that's great, but you know, I'm much more interested in understanding how these things move around at this scale, right? Nothing is static. Everything is moving, right? All the atoms in this room and you and everything are vibrating and moving. Nothing is stationary, okay? And what's more is when materials go through a phase transition, right? If you talk about forming martensite, for example, those atoms have to move and rearrange themselves somehow to form this new structure. So the question is, how do they do that? And can I watch it happen? Right? So that's what we're very interested in trying to understand. So before we do that, let's figure out what this can do in that sense, right? I can take static pictures, great, but can I watch these things change and rearrange? Well, let's think about that for a second. So let's first look at the state of the art in terms of time-resolved imaging with TEMs. Okay, this is kind of what really the best that you can do in terms of time resolution prior to the work that we're now doing. So this is a sort of a low magnification electron micrograph of material yttrium iron oxide. This is a magneto-optic material. It's used in optical communications and so on. And there was always a big problem with trying to understand how it crystallizes. So when you deposit this down as a film, it's amorphous, it's a glass. And then in order to get it to function as in the operations that you want, you needed to crystallize. And so you go through some crystallization processes to do that. But it was never really working very well, and it was hard to understand how it crystallized, why it crystallized, where it did, and so on. So we did some experiments where we took this glass, we put it in our TEM, and then we would heat it up, and we would watch it crystallize, okay? And so up on the top portion here, sort of this kind of chaotic contrast, weak contrast region all through here, this is the glass. It's really nanocrystalline. It's not really a glass. If you zoomed way in, you would see tiny, tiny little crystallites of this material, okay? And then here you can see sort of something different. And this region down here is a single crystal. So this has crystallized inside of the TEM, okay? And now this is a single crystal. And all these little light and dark features that you see are defects in the material. These might be line dislocations or a bend in the material or something like that, okay? And so what we're going to do is we're going to play a video, and basically we're going to watch this thing crystallize. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. So laser is off. That's how we heat this. We're going to turn the laser on now, and you can see this thing crystallize, right? All that glass goes away. It turns into this big single crystal chunk inside the TEM, okay? And so we just watched that, would you agree, in real time? Would you agree to that? Yeah, it just happened in real time, right? Okay, so that's great. That's exciting. We can learn a lot from that, right? We can use Avrami kinetics and things like that to understand this. Hopefully you guys remember that, right? Avrami, yeah? Okay. And so that's pretty interesting, but let's think about the time scale associated with this. And then let's think about, you know, you're all curious, I'm curious. Let's ask some questions about what was happening. For example, right, this thing is crystallizing in a certain way, so how are the atoms actually rearranging themselves to go from sort of disordered to ordered? How does that happen, right? And why does it happen in the way that it does? These are the questions we can start to think about. What will we need to do to answer those questions? Let's think about that. The video you just watched was video rate, what's called video rate imaging. That's 30 frames per second. So iPhone slow-mo can do 240 frames per second, I think, something like that, just to give you a sense of calibration. So the state of the art really is that we can do sort of, these are $500,000 cameras, top of the line, really expensive stuff. They can do 1,000 frames per second. Okay, that's about a millisecond time resolution. That's pretty good. So millisecond, just to calibrate you again, if you're really good at blinking, you can blink your eye about 10 times in a second if you're flying, right? It's probably more like 5 times in a second, right? You can try it. Yeah, people are trying it, good. Right, so you can try it. And so think about that. What that means is it takes me about 0.2 seconds to blink. Okay, so here we're talking about 0.001 seconds, right? So that's just to give you a sense of what we're talking about. That is like top of the line. You're gonna shell out a lot of money, and that's the camera you got, and that's what you're gonna get. There's a problem with this because electrons actually damage the material you look at. If you actually, before I said you couldn't image your finger with that first microscope, you actually wouldn't want to, because you're gonna burn your finger pretty good. You might end up with cancer down the line somewhere in your hand or something crazy, right? Because it's ionizing radiation, right? It's gonna do damage to the material. And whenever we do electron microscopy on materials, we're damaging that material. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it, okay? So that's always something we have to worry about. So we can start to think about this in terms of numbers of electrons I need to form a decent image, right? There has to be some finite number of electrons, some minimum number of electrons I need to actually get a decent image, right? That makes sense, right? It's just like if I have my shutter open on my iPhone for a short amount of time, I don't have enough photons coming in to form a reasonable image, right? It's dark, you can't really make it out. So you have to keep that shutter open longer so you can get more photons coming in, right? Same idea here, exact same idea. I need to have it open long enough so that I get enough electrons coming in and I can form an image. Same idea. That number usually is about 10 to the 8. I usually need about 10 to the 8 electrons to do that. Okay, so we can do a little bit of math here, a little back of envelope calculation here. So electrons damage the material, and I need 10 to the 8 of them to do this. Let's think about this in terms of a current. So if I want to snap a picture with 10 to the 8 electrons in 1 millisecond, the amount of current that specimen is going to see is about 0.01 microamp. Not bad. That's not bad. That's pretty reasonable, actually. So what does that mean? Okay, I'm okay. I'm okay with a millisecond. I can deal with that. Well, let's go to a microsecond. I want to do better. Milliseconds really actually slow on a materials dynamics time scale, right? Because we've already established everything's vibrating and moving, and the time scales at which all of this is occurring are on the order of what are called a femtosecond. So do you guys know what a femtosecond is? So you know what a picosecond is. Nanosecond, 10 to the minus 9. Pico, 10 to the minus 12. Femto is 10 to the minus 15 seconds. That's flying. That means whatever you're looking at does it 10 to the 15 times in 1 second. What? Right? So this is the time scale that it takes if you have a water molecule, right? Hydrogen, oxygen, hydrogen. It's the time that it takes the oxygen and the hydrogen to expand and then contract once. That's about 10 femtoseconds, okay? So that's what we're talking about here. That's what I want to get to. Well, let's start a little more modest. 1 microsecond, 10 to the minus 6. So I got to send in 10 to the 8. I don't have a way around this. 10 microamps now. This is the current I'm dealing with. It's getting hairy. This is getting hairy. I'm going to start actually drilling some holes in my specimen. Well, I care about this. I want to get down to, let's say, 100 femtoseconds, 10 to the minus 13 seconds, 100 amps. This thing's cooked. It's gone. You have nothing left. It's done, right? You've completely sputtered everything. Your specimen is dead, right? There is no way. Yikes. This will do serious damage. Well, so that's a problem. So what do we do about this? There's another problem, and that is because this is the very best I can do for a lot of money right now, what it means is if my shutter is a millisecond, all of the processes that are happening, I already told you, right? Materials at the atomic scale are moving very, very fast, much, much faster than milliseconds. So all of the dynamics and the exciting things that are happening in that time, it's all sort of averaged together in that 1 millisecond image, right? It's like if you tried to snap a picture of Usain Bolt with a shutter open on your phone for a very long time, it would be a blur. Same exact idea here. All the dynamics are blurred out. It's a mess. You have no idea what's going on. So you're integrating over that, all of that dynamics. It's all sort of hodgepodge together. But we've already said atomic scale dynamics are not only fast, but ultra fast, right? I don't know why we adopted this word. It's screwy, but whatever. So ultra fast dynamics, right? And I'll give you an example as a materials scientist, maybe that you can relate to a little bit more than a water molecule. Speed of sound in germanium, a germanium crystal, it depends on the direction you're talking about, but let's say it's 5.4 kilometers per second. If we think about that on the scales that we care about today, it's about 5.4 nanometers per picosecond. Okay, nanometers per picosecond. That's kind of the scale we're dealing with. So what does that say? If I look at the unit cell dimension of germanium, the time to travel a unit cell length or a unit cell distance, it's about 100 femtoseconds. So if I have a sound wave moving through the material, what it means is the time it takes that sound wave at the speed of sound to move a unit cell is about 100 femtoseconds. So you've probably heard very generally, right, that certain sorts of diffusionless transformations in materials, right, the atoms aren't actually having to diffuse and move through the material. It's a diffusionless process, and you've probably heard this happens at the speed of sound, right, more or less. So this is what we're dealing with. This is what we're talking about. If I want to sit and I want to see a diffusionless process occur at the unit cell scale, these are the time scales I'm going to need. Okay? So this is really not going to cut it. This is really not going to do it. And in fact, the cameras, $1 million, 10 orders of magnitude too slow. Not a factor of 10, a factor of 10 to the 10, right? Like just ridiculous. Forget it. Don't throw them away. Don't use them. We're done. Let's go home. No, we don't need to go home. We're going to do a different approach. We're going to come at this in a different way. Okay, so here is the concept that we need to adopt in order to fix this problem. And we've got to just think about this in a completely different way. Fortunately, there are a lot of folks that have sort of figured this out with optical cameras and things like that already, and we're just going to take those ideas and apply them to the TEM. That's what we're going to do. So there's a recipe for how we do this, and the way we do it's called stroboscopic imaging. So strobe light, right? Everybody knows what a strobe light is, right? We're going to use that concept of a strobe light, okay? And we're going to develop what we're going to call a femtosecond, a very fast shutter. That's the idea, okay? So what's the recipe for doing that? Well, we want to have a very short source, or a very short, brief packet of electrons is what I'll call it. And the reason is because imagine I have a material and it's moving with some velocity, let's say, some time scale. If I don't want that to be blurred, I want to pass the electrons that I'm going to use to form the image or the diffraction pattern through it in such a way that these go by very quick before this material has a chance to move quite a bit, right? I basically want to freeze that motion, and then maybe it moves, do it again, maybe it moves, do it again, right? So if I have a huge packet of electrons moving really slow, this thing's moving as the electrons are passing through, you know, that's a problem. I'm blurred again, right? Just like Usain Bolt running past your camera, okay? So I need a really short source relative to the dynamics that I want to see, okay? And this might be a pulse of photons, or for us, it's going to be electrons. I have to use some proper frequency of the pulses. This might be a repeating process, so I have to marry the frequencies together. Now, you have all seen this, right? So by doing this, I don't need the camera anymore. That's the main point. But you've all seen this idea, this wagon wheel effect, okay? Don't worry about the aliasing idea. But do you know what the wagon wheel effect is? Have you heard of that? So who's ever watched television? So we all have. Who's ever seen a car commercial on television? Probably all of us, right? Who's ever seen one of the wheels on the car when you're watching that commercial not move even though it's driving down the road? You've seen that before, right? It looks like it's kind of not moving and maybe it spins backwards. And have you ever thought, like, what? Why is it doing that? Have you ever thought about that? The reason it does that is because the wheel, right, is symmetric. Maybe it's 5 spokes or something, and it's spinning with a certain frequency, right? You're going 60 miles an hour, you can calculate what the frequency is. Your camera is also snapping pictures at a certain frequency, right? It's taking, that's what these videos are. It's a series of many, many pictures, 30 per second, 60 per second, something like that, right? So think about this now. If my frequencies are matched up such that this thing is spinning, such that a spoke is here and now it's here, the camera doesn't care where each of those spokes is, right? The picture's going to look the same if this thing moves the same amount every time I snap a picture, right? So that's why you can take a strobe light and you can twirl something and it looks like it's sort of just stuck in space because you've matched up the frequencies, right? This is awesome because now I can freeze out very fast repeating motions by timing up these frequencies just right. And that's what these car commercials do. It's called the wagon wheel effect, okay? And you can see that you can do all kinds of tricks with this, right? So I can take a couple tubes, I can have nozzles vibrating like this such that they generate droplets, right? And clearly, like, we haven't beaten gravity or anything, right? Gravity's still a thing, the droplets still go down like this. But what's happening here is I have a strobe light off to the side over here, and I'm slightly changing the frequency relative to the droplets coming out, right? So I can make it look like the droplets are suspended in space. I can make it look like they go back up. I can make it look like they come back down, right? Just by timing those together. This is the wagon wheel effect, okay? We're going to steal this idea, and we're going to use it in our TEM. That's what we're going to do, okay? Now, this has already been done with spectroscopy. There was a Nobel Prize given for it in 1999. This was called femtochemistry, where they actually used lasers and laser pulses to, quote-unquote, image molecules undergoing reactions. Okay, now it was done with spectroscopy, so imaging, I don't know about that so much. But anyway, that was the idea. You have a very short flash of light. You can time it such that it's sort of together with the time scale of the molecules changing during the reactions, and you can get information in, quote-unquote, real time, okay? So the key here is we want to have a stopwatch, just like we're starting sprinters at a starting line with a starter's pistol, right? We want to have a stopwatch such that we can trigger the process at a time that we dictate. We want to know when things start, so we know when we can start taking pictures. That's the idea. So in this case, the trigger is a laser pulse. You start the molecular reaction, and then there's a second laser pulse that probes, okay, that response, okay? And there's scattering. There's all kinds of things you can do with it, okay? And so with that, you could actually get down to the time scales that molecules react, and you could figure out actually how they change in space and time. Pretty cool. So we're going to steal these ideas. So how do we do that? Here's the TEM I already showed you. This is actually our TEM. It's right over across the hall over here in the corner, and down in the basement here in a really nice lab space. And so basically what we do is we take this transmission electron microscope and we modify it just to have these two little gizmos on the side. And these little gizmos on the side that are just blown up a little bit here just allow us to send laser pulses into the TEM. Okay, why would you want to do that? Well, for one, right, we want to trigger the response. We want to have our starter's pistol, we want to trigger the response in the material. We're going to do that with a very short laser pulse, a femtosecond laser pulse. Okay, that's one. The second reason we want to send laser pulses into the top here is because we want to use the photoelectric effect that Einstein told us about, right? If I have a semiconducting material, has a low work function again, or a metal for that matter, and I shine light on it that has a certain frequency, let's say it's a UV wavelength, and I do that, I get electrons out, right? That's awesome, because now what I can do is I can control when the electrons come out of my source, how many come out and how often they come out. Because they're only going to come out when I send those laser pulses in. That's the only time they're coming out. In between those pulses, no electrons. Now I've got this pulsed source. I can set up the frequency. I can excite the material. There's some wagon wheel thing going on in there, right? And I can probe it just like that. And just like that, I don't have to rely on this camera anymore. I don't care about it. It can be the slowest camera ever made. In fact, it could be photographic film. Doesn't matter to me, right? What it means is that the time resolution now is dictated only by the laser pulse duration. So if I use a 100 femtosecond laser to do this process, my time resolution is 100 femtoseconds. Okay? Everybody with me? Okay, good. This is just the concept now that we would do. And imagine this process, this material response has some, let's say this is intensity of something as a function of time. Okay, that's kind of what you're looking at here. And it might have this shape. Just imagine it as a car wheel spinning, right? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start that car wheel spinning with my laser pulse. So that would be right here. The car wheel starts to spin, and then maybe it slows down. Okay? Car wheel starts to spin again, maybe it slows down. And what I'm going to do, and so I'm going to do that with these N sub p h nu packets of photons. Send that in, do something to that car wheel. Okay? Now I'm going to also send in my electron packets, right? These discrete sort of packets that I'm controlling with this laser pulse that I'm sending in. So I'm just getting little spits of electrons coming out. Okay? And I'm going to vary the arrival time of these photons and these electrons at the specimen or the car wheel. And I'm going to build up my dynamics that way. I'm going to sample this dynamics with a very short packet of electrons in space and in time. And I'm going to slowly build up my image. And that image should be identical each shot to each shot because I'm sampling the car wheel at the same point in space. Okay? And that way I can build up all this image with a time resolution of about 100 femtoseconds or so. And then what I can do if I want to make a movie of this process is I just change the arrival time of these things relative to one another so that I sample it at a different point in time and space. Okay? And then I stitch all that together at the end and I get a video. All right? Everybody with me on that? Okay. Well, let's take a look at an example. So we've been interested in germanium for a little while for a ton of reasons. And you might think germanium, boring, right? Who cares? Well, it turns out it's actually a pretty wicked, interesting material. It's pretty cool. There's a lot of stuff that goes on in it. If you shine a laser pulse on it, it does all kinds of wild stuff. And so we were pretty interested in that. And so we wanted to actually image this process of what's called strain wave generation in materials. So it turns out if you shine laser light on a semiconductor, there is a huge number of things that happen. I mean huge. And they span a huge range of time. First thing, what do you think happens? The electrons are excited, right? That's what light does. It interacts with the electrons in the material initially, right? They're going to scatter off all kinds of stuff. Pretty soon you get what are called phonons excited in the material. These are oscillations of the lattice. Starts moving around because of all these scattering processes. So now these things are going crazy. What they're going to do then is there's different modes because of different bond strengths in different directions, different spacings. They start to couple together. It starts going crazy, right? And then pretty soon these things start to kind of settle down. They're high energy and okay, it's been a couple picoseconds, I'm pooped. I'm going to just settle down now. But they end up coupling their energy into other modes that are much lower energy. They're a bit slower, they kind of slosh around a little bit. And now imagine I have a real material, right? Are there any chemistry double majors in here? Okay, I'm not going to talk anything disparaging about chemistry then. I'll be very complimentary. But in real materials, there are defects, and you have to pay attention to those defects, okay? I'm actually a chemistry major by training and so on and so forth, so from here. So, we need to pay attention to those defects. Let's just put it that way. And that is where it gets very interesting, right? Because now all of these processes, it's very hard to understand them because there's line dislocations, there's vacancies, there's interfaces, there's boundaries, there's all this stuff. So how could we possibly understand these processes? Image them. Let's go in and take a look, all right? So that's what we do. So this is, again, one of these TEM images of a germanium crystal. It's a single crystal. But you see all kinds of light and dark features. Again, these are regions of the crystal that are bent a little bit. There might be a dislocation. And what's more is you see kind of these lines that are running almost vertically through the material, right? Everybody sees those, right? So what these are is we have to polish these things pretty thin, because remember, the electrons interact really strongly with the material. So if we want to have any hope of getting electrons through the material so we can actually form an image, it has to be pretty thin. So otherwise it's going to be blocked. It's just not going to go through. So we polish it very thin mechanically. And what these little things are ridges on the surface of the crystal. And they're like 10 nanometers high. They're about 100 nanometers wide. And they always show up whenever you polish these crystals. You just can't get around it. It's because you use different slurries and grits to make these things, okay? So these are actually turned out to be really interesting, and we did not expect this at all, okay? So I'm going to play the video. This is an ultrafast electron microscope video. Our shutter, our time resolution here is about a picosecond, okay? So before we could do a millisecond, right? So it's better. All right, so, and what you're gonna see is I have a little timestamp up at the top here. This says minus 75 PS. PS means picoseconds. And the minus means this is 75 picoseconds before I send in that laser pulse. Think of the laser pulse as a hammer, and think of this as a bell. So at 0 PS, I'm gonna ring the bell, okay? So let's just go ahead and watch it, and then I'll do my best to explain to you what's going on. So there we ring the bell. This is the most amazing thing I've ever seen in my life. I'm not kidding. This is unbelievable. So what these are called acoustic phonons. So these are these waves of lattice moving, right? Sloshing around in the material. And this is energy moving through this material. And I want you to look, right? This is all done in about 1.7 nanoseconds. All of this happens in 1.7 times 10 to the minus 9 seconds. Remember, you can blink in about 0.2 seconds. So this is fleeting process. So we hit it, boom, and all these waves start moving through this material. You can see they kind of follow along these lines. That's not by accident, we think. We don't know yet for sure. But we think that's on purpose. We're doing experiments now to see if we can guide these things through this material just by changing their positions, right? That would be a big deal, okay? And you can see all kinds of other wacky stuff goes on, right? There's weird shimmering. It looks like water shimmering and so on, right? This is absolutely amazing to be able to do this inside of a TEM, okay? So let's think about this. So we excite this with our femtosecond laser. That happens. This happens just with a laser pulse, right? So you should be asking yourself, how does that happen, right? Great question. We don't know for sure, right? We're still trying to figure that out too. So we're taking pictures about every 5 picoseconds, right? And so the other thing is, well, what happens every half a picosecond? Good question. We're going to figure that out too, right? So this spans, again, about 1.8 nanoseconds. So this is a slow motion video. The fact that you're watching it on the time scale of seconds means it's slow-mo, right? And it happens to be slow-mo by about 6.7 billion times. That's all, right? It's just a little bit slow-mo. Okay. So if you go ahead and you analyze it, this is really interesting, and I don't have an answer for this. If you go ahead and you analyze these things, each of these black squares is one of these waves. And we're basically just going to follow it moving through this material. Okay, and that's what we did. And it turns out each of these waves moving in this direction moves at a constant velocity. The velocity doesn't change as it moves through here. But what happens is if you go later in time, the waves that show up later are actually slower than the previous ones. So you have this sort of slowing down of this process, and it actually asymptotes to the bulk speed of sound, which means the waves early on are hypersonic. Okay, and in fact, we've measured waves going about 7 times the speed of sound in this material. And that's not a mistake, it's real. We've reproduced it, it's a real thing. So we're still trying to understand that too, as you can imagine. Why are these things moving at such high velocities? Okay, so very, very, very interesting stuff. So much information in this one video alone that we're still trying to unravel what's going on. Okay? So that's it. I'm going to stop there.